Truth, Nicholas of Cusa, Nietzsche, and the Efficacy of Doubt. An insightful glimpse by H.L. Mencken. At the bottom of all philosophy, of all science, and of all thinking, you will find the one all-inclusive question. How is man to tell truth from error? The ignorant man solves this problem in a very simple manner. He holds that whatever he believes, he knows, and that whatever he knows is true. This is the attitude of all amateur and professional theologians, politicians, and other numbskulls of that sort. The pious old maid, for example, who believes in the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, looks upon her faith as proof, and holds that all who disagree with her will suffer torments in hell. Opposed to this childish theory of knowledge is the chronic doubt of the educated man. He sees daily evidence that many things held to be true by 9/10 of all men are, in reality, false, and he is thereby apt to acquire a doubt of everything, including his own beliefs. At different times in the history of man, various methods of solving or evading the riddle have been proposed. In the age of faith, it was held that, by his own efforts alone, man was unable, even partly, to distinguish between truth and error, but that he could always go for enlightenment to an infallible encyclopedia, the Word of God as set forth through the instrumentality of inspired scribes in the Holy Scriptures. If these scriptures said that a certain proposition was true, it was true, and any man who doubted it was either a lunatic or a criminal. This doctrine prevailed in Europe for many years, and all who ventured to oppose it were in danger of being killed, but in the course of time, the number of doubters grew so large that it was inconvenient or impossible to kill all of them, and so, in the end, they had to be permitted to voice their doubts unharmed. The first man of this new era to inflict any real damage upon the ancient churchly idea of revealed wisdom was Nicholas of Cusa, a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, who lived in the early part of the 15th century. Despite his office and his time, Nicholas was an independent and intelligent man, and it became apparent to him, after long reflection, that mere belief in a thing was by no means a proof of its truth. Man, he decided, was prone to err, but in the worst of his errors there was always some kernel of truth, else he would revolt against it as inconceivable. Therefore, he decided, the best thing for man to do was to hold all of his beliefs lightly and to reject them whenever they began to appear as errors. The real danger, he said, was not in making mistakes, but in clinging to them after they were known to be mistakes. It seems well nigh impossible that a man of Nicholas' age and training should have reasoned so clearly, but the fact remains that he did, and that all of modern philosophy is built upon the foundations he laid. Since his time, a great many other theories of knowledge have been put forward, but all have worked, in a sort of circle, back to Nicholas. It would be interesting, perhaps, to trace the course and history of these variations and denials, but such an enterprise is beyond the scope of the present inquiry. Nicola by no means gave the world a complete and wholly credible system of philosophy. Until the day of his death, scholasticism was dominant in the world that he knew, and it retained its old hold upon human thought, in fact, for nearly 200 years thereafter. Not until Descartes, in 1619, made his famous resolution to take nothing for the truth without clear knowledge that it is such, did humanity in general begin to realize, as Huxley says, that there was sanctity in doubt. And even Descartes could not shake himself free of the supernaturalism and other balderdash which yet colored philosophy. He laid down, for all time, the emancipating doctrine that the profession of belief in propositions, of the truth of which there is no sufficient evidence, is immoral, a doctrine that might well be called the Magna Charta of human thought, but it should not be forgotten that he also laid down other doctrines, and that many of them were visionary and silly. The philosophers after him rid their minds of the old ideas, but slowly, and there were frequent reversions to the ancient delusion that a man's mind is a function of his soul, whatever that may be, and not of his body. It was common, indeed, for a philosopher to set out with sane, debatable, conceivable ideas, and then to go soaring into the idealistic clouds. Only in our own time have men come to understand that the ego, for all its seeming independence, is nothing more than the sum of inherited race experience, that a man's soul, his conscience, and his attitude of mind are things he has inherited from his ancestors, just as he has inherited his 2 eyes, his 10 toes, and his firm belief in signs, portents, and immortality. Only in our own time have men ceased seeking a golden key to all riddles and sat themselves down to solve one riddle at a time. Those metaphysicians who fared farthest from the philosopher of Cusa evolved the doctrine that in themselves things have no existence at all, and that we can think of them only in terms of our impressions of them. The color green, for example, may be nothing but a delusion, for all we can possibly know of it is that under certain conditions our optic nerves experience a sensation of greenness. Whether this sensation of greenness is a mere figment of our imagination or the reflection of an actual physical state is something that we cannot tell. It is impossible, in a word, to determine whether there are actual things around us which produce real impressions upon us, or whether our idea of these things is the mere result of subjective impressions or conditions. We know that a blow on the eyes may cause us to see a flash of light which does not exist, and that a nervous person may feel the touch of hands and hear noises which are purely imaginary. May it not be possible also that all other sensations have their rise within us instead of without, and that in saying that objects give us impressions, we have been confusing cause and effect? Such is the argument of those metaphysicians who doubt not only the accuracy of human knowledge, but also the very capacity of human beings to acquire knowledge. It is apparent, on brief reflection, that this attitude, while theoretically admissible, is entirely impracticable, and that, as a matter of fact, it gives us no more substantial basis for intelligent speculation than the old device of referring all questions to revelation. To say that nothing exists save in the imagination of living beings is to say that this imagination itself does not exist. This, of course, is an absurdity, because every man is absolutely certain that he himself is a real thing, and that his mind is a real thing too, and capable of thought. In place of such cobweb spinning, modern philosophers, driven to it, it may be said, in parenthesis, by the scientists, have gone back to the doctrine that, inasmuch as we can know nothing of anything save through the impressions it makes upon us, these impressions must be accepted provisionally as accurate, so long as they are evidently normal and harmonize one with the other. That is to say, our perceptions, corrected by our experience and our common sense, must serve as guides for us, and we must seize every opportunity to widen their range and increase their accuracy. For millions of years they have been steadily augmenting our store of knowledge. We know, for instance, that when fire touches us, it causes an impression which we call pain, and that this impression is invariably the same, and always leads to the same results in all normal human beings. Therefore, we accept it as an axiom that fire causes pain. There are many other ideas that may be and have been established in the same manner, by the fact that they are universal among sane men. But there is also a multitude of things which produce different impressions upon different men, and here we encounter the problem of determining which of these impressions is right and which is wrong. One man, observing the rising and setting of the sun, concludes that it is a ball of fire revolving about the earth. Another man, in the face of the same phenomena, concludes that the earth revolves around the sun. How, then, are we to determine which of these men has drawn the proper conclusion? As a matter of fact, it is impossible in such a case to come to any decision which can be accepted as utterly and absolutely true. But all the same, the scientific empiric method enables us to push the percentage of error nearer and nearer to the irreducible minimum. We can observe the phenomenon under examination from a multitude of sides and compare the impression it produces with the impressions produced by kindred phenomena regarding which we know more. Again, we can put this examination into the hands of men specially trained and fitted for such work, men whose conclusions we know, by previous experience, to be above the average of accuracy. And so, after a long time, we can formulate some idea of the thing under inspection which violates few or none of the other ideas held by us. When we have accomplished this, we have come as near to the absolute truth as it is possible for human beings to come. I need not point out that this method does not contemplate a mere acceptance of the majority vote. Its actual effect, indeed, is quite the contrary, for it is only a small minority of human beings who may be said, with any truth, to be capable of thought. It is probable, for example, that 9/10 of the people in Christendom today believe that Friday is an unlucky day, while only the remaining tenth hold that one day is exactly like another. But despite this, it is apparent that the idea of the latter will survive, and that, by slow degrees, it will be forced upon the former. We know that it is true, not because it is accepted by all men or by the majority of men, for, as a matter of fact, we have seen that it isn't, but because we realize that the few who hold to it are best capable of distinguishing between actual impressions and mere delusions. Again, the scientific method tends to increase our knowledge by the very fact that it discourages unreasoning faith. The scientist realizes that most of his so-called facts are probably errors, and so he is willing to harbor doubts of their truth and to seek for something better. Like Socrates, he boldly says, "I know that I am ignorant." He realizes, in fact, that error, when it is constantly under fire, is bound to be resolved in the long run into something approximating the truth. As Nicholas pointed out 500 years ago, nothing is utterly and absolutely true, and nothing is utterly and absolutely false. There is always a germ of truth in the worst error, and there is always a residuum of error in the soundest truth. Therefore, an error is fatal only when it is hidden from the white light of investigation. Herein lies the difference between the modern scientist and the moralist. The former holds nothing sacred, not even his own axioms. The latter lays things down as law and then makes it a crime to doubt them. It is in this way, by submitting every idea to a searching, pitiless, unending examination, that the world is increasing its store of what may be called, for the sake of clearness, absolute knowledge. Error always precedes truth, and it is extremely probable that the vast majority of ideas held by men of today, even the sanest and wisest men, are delusions, but with the passing of the years, our stock of truth grows larger and larger. A conviction, says Nietzsche, always has its history, its previous forms, its tentative forms, its states of error. It becomes a conviction indeed only after having been not a conviction, and then hardly a conviction. No doubt falsehood is one of these embryonic forms of conviction. Sometimes only a change of persons is needed to transform one into the other. That which, in the Son, is a conviction, was, in the Father, still a falsehood. The tendency of intelligent men, in a word, is to approach nearer and nearer the truth by the processes of rejection, revision, and invention. Many old ideas are rejected by each new generation, but there always remain a few that survive. We no longer believe with the cavemen that the thunder is the voice of an angry god and the lightning the flash of his sword, but we still believe, as they did, that wood floats upon water, that seeds sprout and give forth plants, that a roof keeps off the rain, and that a child, if it lives long enough, will inevitably grow into a man or a woman. Such ideas may be called truths. If we deny them, we must deny at once that the world exists, and that we exist ourselves. Nietzsche's discussion of these problems is so abstruse and so much complicated by changes in view that it would be impossible to make an understandable summary of it in the space available here. In his first important book, Menschliches also Menschliches, he devoted himself in the main to pointing out errors made in the past without laying down any very definite scheme of thought for the future. In the early stages of human progress, he said, men made the mistake of regarding everything that was momentarily pleasant or beneficial as absolutely and eternally true. Herein, they manifested the very familiar human weakness for rash and hasty generalization, and the equally familiar tendency to render the ideas of a given time and place perpetual and permanent by erecting them into codes of morality and putting them into the mouths of gods. This, he pointed out, was harmful, for a thing might be beneficial to the men of today and fatal to the men of tomorrow. Therefore, he argued that while a certain idea's effect was a good criterion, humanly speaking, of its present or current truth, it was dangerous to assume that this effect would be always the same, and that, in consequence, the idea itself would remain true forever. Not until the days of Socrates, said Nietzsche, did men begin to notice this difference between immanent truth and eternal truth. The notion that such a distinction existed made its way very slowly, even after great teachers began to teach it. But in the end, it was accepted by enough men to give it genuine weight. Since that day, philosophy and science, which were once merely different names for the same thing, have signified two separate things. It is the object of philosophy to analyze happiness, and by means of the knowledge thus gained, to devise means for safeguarding and increasing it. In consequence, it is necessary for philosophy to generalize, to assume that the thing which makes men happy today will make them happy tomorrow. Science, on the contrary, concerns itself, not with things of the uncertain future, but with things of the certain present. Its object is to examine the world as it exists today, to uncover as many of its secrets as possible, and to study their effect upon human happiness. In other words, philosophy first constructs a scheme of happiness and then tries to fit the world to it, while science studies the world with no other object in view than the increase of knowledge, and with full confidence that, in the long run, this increase of knowledge will increase efficiency and, in consequence, happiness. It is evident, then, that science, for all its contempt for fixed schemes of happiness, will eventually accomplish with certainty what philosophy, which most commonly swims into the ken of the average man as morality, is now trying to do in a manner that is not only crude and unreasonable, but also necessarily unsuccessful. In a word, just so soon as man's store of knowledge grows so large that he becomes complete master of the natural forces which work toward his undoing, he will be perfectly happy. Now, Nietzsche believed, as we have seen in past chapters, that man's instinctive will to power had this same complete mastery over his environment as its ultimate object, and so he concluded that the will to power might be relied upon to lead man to the truth. That is to say, he believed that there was, in every man of the higher type, the only type he thought worth discussing, an instinctive tendency to seek the true as opposed to the false, that this instinct, as the race progressed, grew more and more accurate, and that its growing accuracy explained the fact that, despite the opposition of codes of morality and of the iron hand of authority, man constantly increased his store of knowledge. A thought, he said, arose in a man without his initiative or volition, and was nothing more or less than an expression of his innate will to obtain power over his environment by accurately observing and interpreting it. It was just as reasonable, he said, to say, it thinks as to say, I think, because every intelligent person knew that a man couldn't control his thoughts. Therefore, the fact that these thoughts, in the long run, and considering the human race as a whole, tended to uncover more and more truths, proved that the will to power, despite the danger of generalizing from its manifestations, grew more and more accurate, and so worked in the direction of absolute truth. Nietzsche believed that mankind was ever the slave of errors, but he held that the number of errors tended to decrease. When, at last, truth reigned supreme and there were no more errors, the Superman would walk the earth. Now it is impossible for any man to note the workings of the will to power, save as it is manifested in his own instincts and thoughts, and therefore Nietzsche, in his later books, urges that every man should be willing, at all times, to pit his own feelings against the laws laid down by the majority. A man should steer clear of rash generalization from his own experience, but he should be doubly careful to steer clear of the generalizations of others. The greatest of all dangers lies in subscribing to a thesis without being certain of its truth. This not wishing to see what one sees is a primary requisite for membership in a party, in any sense whatsoever. Therefore, the party man becomes a liar by necessity. The proper attitude for a human being, indeed, is chronic dissent and skepticism. Zarathustra is a skeptic. Convictions are prisons. The freedom from every kind of permanent conviction, the ability to search freely, belong to strength. The need of a belief, of something that is unconditioned, is a sign of weakness. The man of belief is necessarily a dependent man. His instinct gives the highest honor to self-abnegation. He does not belong to himself, but to the author of the idea he believes. It is only by skepticism, argues Nietzsche, that we can hope to make any progress. If all men accepted without question the dicta of someone supreme sage, it is plain that there could be no further increase of knowledge. It is only by constant turmoil and conflict and exchange of views that the minute granules of truth can be separated from the vast muck heap of superstition and error. Fixed truths, in the long run, are probably more dangerous to intelligence than falsehoods. This argument, I take it, scarcely needs greater elucidation. Every intelligent man knows that if there had been no brave agnostics to defy the wrath of the Church in the Middle Ages, the whole of Christendom would still wallow in the unspeakably foul morass of ignorance which had its centre, during that black time, in an infallible sovereign of sovereigns. Authority, at all times and everywhere, means sloth and degeneration. It is only doubt that creates. It is only the minority that counts. The fact that the great majority of human beings are utterly incapable of original thought, and so must, perforce, borrow their ideas or submit tamely to some authority, explains Nietzsche's violent loathing and contempt for the masses. The average, self-satisfied, conservative, orthodox, law-abiding citizen appeared to him to be a being but little raised above the cattle in the barnyard. So violent was this feeling that every idea accepted by the majority excited, for that very reason, his suspicion and opposition. "What everybody believes," he once said, "is never true." This may seem like a mere voicing of Brobdingnagian egotism, but as a matter of fact, the same view is held by every man who has spent any time investigating the history of ideas. "Truth," said Dr. Osler a while ago, "scarcely ever carries the struggle for acceptance at its first appearance. The masses are always a century or two behind. They have made a virtue of their obtuseness and call it by various fine names: conservatism, piety, respectability, faith. The 19th century witnessed greater human progress than all the centuries before it saw or even imagined, but the majority of white men of today still believe in ghosts, still fear the devil, still hold that the number 13 is unlucky, and still picture the deity as a patriarch in a white beard, surrounded by a choir of resplendent amateur musicians. "We think a thing," says Professor Henry Sedgwick, "because all other people think so, or because, after all, we do think so, or because we are told so and think we must think so, or because we once thought so and think we still think so, or because, having thought so, we think we will think so." Naturally enough, Nietzsche was an earnest opponent of the theological doctrine of free will. He held, as we have seen, that every human act was merely the effect of the will to power reacting against environment, and in consequence he had to reject absolutely the notion of volition and responsibility. A man, he argued, was not an object in vacuo, and his acts, thoughts, impulses and motives could not be imagined without imagining some cause for them. If this cause came from without, it was clearly beyond his control, and if it came from within, it was no less so, for his whole attitude of mind, his instinctive habits of thoughts, his very soul, so called, were merely attributes that had been handed down to him, like the shape of his nose and the color of his eyes, from his ancestors. Nietzsche held that the idea of responsibility was the product and not the cause of the idea of punishment, and that the latter was nothing more than a manifestation of primitive man's will to power, to triumph over his fellows by making them suffer the handicap and humiliation of pain. Men were called free, he said, in order that they might be condemned and punished. When we immoralists try to cleanse psychology, history, nature, and sociology of these notions, we find that our chief enemies are the theologians, who, with their preposterous idea of a moral order of the world, go on tainting the innocence of man's struggle upward with talk of punishment and guilt. Christianity is, indeed, a hangman's metaphysic. As a necessary corollary of this, Nietzsche denied the existence of any plan in the cosmos. Like Haeckel, he believed that but two things existed, energy and matter, and that all the phenomena which made us conscious of the universe were nothing more than symptoms of the constant action of the one upon the other. Nothing ever happened without a cause, he said, and no cause was anything other than the effect of some previous cause. The destiny of man, he said, cannot be disentangled from the destiny of everything else in existence, past, present, and future. We are a part of the whole. We exist in the whole. There is nothing which could judge, measure, or condemn our being, for that would be to judge, measure, and condemn the whole. But there is nothing outside of the whole. The concept of God has hitherto made our existence a crime. We deny God. We deny responsibility by denying God. It is only thereby that we save man. Herein, unluckily, Nietzsche fell into the trap which has snapped upon Haeckel and every other supporter of atheistic determinism. He denied that the human will was free and argued that every human action was inevitable, and yet he spent his whole life trying to convince his fellow men that they should do otherwise than as they did in fact. In a word, he held that they had no control whatever over their actions, and yet, like Moses, Mohammed, and St. Francis, he thundered at them uproariously and urged them to turn from their errors and repent.